The smell of fresh bread masks the scent of fear in Kasia's small bakery on Nowolipie Street. It's 1943, and Warsaw's Jewish ghetto is a prison wrapped in barbed wire and German bullets. To the SS patrols, Kasia is just another Polish girl kneading dough before dawn. They have no idea she's memorized 17 different sewer routes beneath their feet. Hidden in her flour sack are coded messages that could save hundreds of lives or end them all. Today's delivery should be routine: slip through the drainage tunnel, meet her contact by the old fountain, exchange intelligence about the planned ghetto uprising. But when she emerges from the underground darkness, SS uniforms surround the meeting point like wolves. Her contact is nowhere to be seen. Instead, a Gestapo officer holds a blood-stained piece of paper, her own handwriting visible in the streetlight. Someone has betrayed the network, someone she trusted with her life. Now Kasia must choose between saving herself or warning the resistance fighters who depend on her. But in a city where neighbors disappear in the night, how do you know who's really on your side? Kasia's heart hammered against her ribs as she crouched in the shadow of a bombed-out building, watching the Germans search the area around the fountain. The officer with her coded message, Hauptmann Müller, she recognized his angular face from wanted posters, barked orders at his men. They kicked over trash bins and swept their flashlight beams across every doorway, hunting. She pressed herself deeper into the rubble, feeling the sharp edges of broken brick dig into her back through her thin coat. The flour sack containing tonight's messages felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Inside were details about weapon caches, safe house locations, and the timing for the uprising that could be the ghetto's only chance at freedom. A rat scurried across her feet, and she bit down on her tongue to keep from gasping. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as she counted the soldiers. 8 men, 2 vehicles, all blocking the route she'd planned to use for escape. 3 hours ago, she'd been measuring flour and checking the temperature of her ovens, same as every morning for the past year. The bakery provided perfect cover. German soldiers loved her rye bread and never questioned why a 17-year-old girl worked alone before sunrise. They certainly never suspected that the basement trapdoor led to a network of tunnels that had become the resistance's lifeline. Tomasz should have been here by now. Her contact was never late, couldn't afford to be. He'd survived 2 years of courier runs by being precise, careful, invisible, the kind of man who memorized German patrol schedules and could disappear into a crowd of 3. If he wasn't here, he was either dead or captured. The thought made her stomach clench. Tomasz had been her first teacher when she joined the network 6 months ago, showing her how to read the subtle chalk marks that indicated safe passage, how to move through the sewers without making noise, how to swallow coded messages if capture seemed inevitable. He'd saved her life twice, once from a German patrol that had spotted her near the ghetto wall, once from a group of Polish collaborators who'd grown suspicious of her late-night activities. A shout from Müller made her freeze. He was waving the bloody paper in the air, speaking rapid German to another officer. Even from her hiding spot 50 meters away, she could make out portions of her careful handwriting, the locations of tomorrow night's weapons drop, written in the numerical code she and Tomasz had developed together. The betrayal cut deeper than fear. Someone in their cell had given the Germans not just tonight's meeting details, but her handwriting samples. Someone who'd sat around the same table, shared the same risks, sworn the same oaths about dying before revealing network secrets. She counted the possibilities. Marek, the young doctor who smuggled medical supplies into the ghetto. Ania, the telephone operator who intercepted German communications. Henrik, the former soldier who trained fighters in the basement of his mother's house. Stefan, the priest who hid Jewish children in his church. Any one of them could have copied her handwriting from previous messages. Any one of them knew tonight's meeting location. Any one of them could have decided that saving their own life was worth destroying dozens of others. The wind shifted, carrying the acrid smell of smoke from the ghetto. Another building burning, another family dead or homeless. Time was running out for everyone trapped behind those walls, and now their best source of intelligence was compromised. Muller folded the bloody paper and tucked it into his coat pocket. The soldiers were pulling back, satisfied that whoever they were hunting had escaped, but they'd be back, and next time they'd know exactly where to look. Kasia waited until the last vehicle disappeared around the corner before moving. The messages in her flour sack seemed to pulse against her hands like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the darkness, resistance fighters were counting on intelligence that might never reach them. She had a choice to make, and dawn was only 3 hours away. The acrid smell of sewage mixed with fear had become as familiar to Mira as the scent of rising dough. She crouched in the tunnel beneath Kasia Street, her fingers tracing the brick wall until they found the loose stone that marked her destination. The coded message felt heavy in her coat pocket, though it weighed no more than a few grams of paper. Above her, the muffled sounds of the ghetto continued. Boots on cobblestone shouted orders in German, the occasional cry that made her stomach clench. Down here, in the labyrinth of tunnels that snaked beneath Warsaw's streets, she moved like a ghost between two worlds. The loose brick came away easily, too easily. Mira's breath caught as she realized the hiding spot was empty, when it should have contained the previous week's intelligence reports from the Aryan side. Someone had already been here. She pressed herself against the slimy wall, listening. Water dripped steadily from somewhere in the darkness ahead. A rat scurried past her feet, but there was something else, a sound that didn't belong, the faint whisper of fabric against stone. Mira's training took over. Dr. Korczak had taught all his young runners the same lesson: when in doubt, retreat and report. But as she began to ease backward toward the entrance tunnel, a beam of light cut through the darkness ahead of her. "Don't move." The voice spoke Polish with a slight accent she couldn't place. Not German, something else. "Turn around slowly." Mira's mind raced. The tunnel behind her led back to the ghetto, but it was a 15-minute crawl to the nearest exit. The passage ahead connected to a network that could take her to 3 different sectors, if she could get past whoever was blocking her way. She turned, squinting into the flashlight beam. The figure behind it was invisible, but she caught the gleam of metal, a gun or knife. "The message in your pocket," the voice continued. "Take it out slowly." How could they know? Only 5 people in the resistance knew about tonight's mission. Mira's mouth went dry as the implications hit her. Someone had talked, someone she trusted. "I don't know what you mean," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. A laugh echoed off the tunnel walls. Mira Kowalski, 17 years old, works at Goldstein's bakery on Nowolipie Street. Parents died in the first roundup 2 years ago, lives with her Aunt Sarah in Building 14. The voice paused. "Shall I continue?" The detailed knowledge made her knees weak. This wasn't a random patrol or lucky guess. Someone had given them everything. "What do you want?" she asked. "The same thing you do. To save lives." The flashlight beam lowered slightly, and she could make out a tall figure in dark clothing. Male, probably in his 30s. "But first, you need to know that your network has been compromised." Mira's hand instinctively moved toward her pocket, and the man tensed. Slowly, he reminded her. Instead of reaching for the message, she lunged sideways into a connecting tunnel she'd spotted earlier. The flashlight beam swung wildly as she scrambled through the narrow opening, her coat tearing on jagged stones. Behind her, she heard cursing in what sounded like Russian. The new tunnel was barely wide enough for her shoulders. She crawled frantically, her knees scraping against broken masonry, following the faint current of air that suggested another exit. Her pursuer was too large to follow easily, but she could hear him trying, grunting with effort, as he forced his way into the passage. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. Mira recognized it. She was beneath the old market square, outside the ghetto walls. 3 different passages led away from this junction, and she'd used all of them before. She chose the middle route, the one that would take her north toward the Aryan district where her contact waited. But as she crawled, the man's words echoed in her mind. "Your network has been compromised." If he was telling the truth, then delivering the message she carried might be walking into another trap. If he was lying, then failing to complete her mission could cost lives. The message contained details about a planned deportation that the resistance needed to know about. Mira paused at another junction, breathing hard. Her rational mind told her to return to the ghetto and report what had happened. Let the adults decide what to do next. But she thought of the families who would be loaded onto cattle cars if the warning didn't get through. Children younger than herself, old people who could barely walk. She made her choice and turned toward the northern tunnel. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but she knew that didn't mean she was safe. If someone in the network was feeding information to the Nazis, or whoever that man worked for, then nowhere was truly safe anymore. As she crawled toward what might be another trap, Mira tried to remember exactly who had known about tonight's mission. The list was short, and each name on it belonged to someone she would have trusted with her life. The morning air carried the scent of burnt bread and fear. Kasia's hands trembled as she kneaded the dough, her mind replaying every detail from the previous night's failed mission. The image of those German boots, so close she could have reached out and touched the leather, haunted her thoughts. Someone had known exactly when and where she would be. "Your bread will be tough as leather if you keep working it like that," muttered Pan Kowalski from behind the counter. The old baker's eyes held a knowing glint that made Kasia's stomach clench. How much did he suspect about her nighttime activities? She forced her hands to still. "Sorry, Pan Kowalski. I didn't sleep well. None of us sleep well anymore, child." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "But some of us have more reason than others to stay awake." Before Kasia could respond, the bakery door chimed. A tall woman in a tattered brown coat entered, her blonde hair pinned beneath a faded headscarf. Kasia recognized her immediately. It was Irina, one of the resistance contacts, but she wasn't supposed to come here. The protocol was clear, no direct contact unless absolutely necessary. "Excuse me," Irina said, her voice carefully casual. "Do you have any rye bread? My children are asking for it specifically." The code phrase sent ice through Kasia's veins. Emergency meeting, maximum danger. Pan Kowalski glanced between them, then disappeared into the back room without a word. "Smart man." "We have some," Kasia replied, reaching beneath the counter for a loaf that didn't exist. "But it's expensive today." "I understand. Perhaps we could discuss the price somewhere more private." Kasia's pulse hammered as she followed Irina to the narrow alley behind the bakery. The woman's composed facade cracked the moment they were alone. "3 safe houses were raided last night," Irina whispered urgently. 7 of our people are dead, 12 more arrested. They knew exactly where to look, Kasia. They had maps." The words hit like physical blows. Kasia gripped the brick wall for support. "Maps? What kind of maps?" "The tunnels, the routes you use. Someone drew them a picture of our entire underground network." Irina's pale eyes searched Kasia's face. "You were supposed to deliver new route information to Pavel last night. Did you make contact?" Kasia's throat went dry. "No, there were soldiers everywhere. I had to abort the mission and hide the message." "Where did you hide it?" "The old pipe junction near Warsaw Street. I've used it before. It's safe." Irina's expression darkened. "Show me, now." They moved through the streets like ghosts, keeping to shadows and side passages. The ghetto felt different in daylight, more dangerous somehow. German patrols seemed more frequent, their searches more thorough. Kasia noticed how Irina's eyes constantly swept their surroundings, cataloguing every face, every movement. The manhole cover near Warsaw Street looked undisturbed. Kasia pried it open with practiced efficiency, dropping into the familiar darkness below. Irina followed, less gracefully but with determined resolve. The tunnel felt wrong, too quiet. Even the rats seemed to have abandoned this section. There, Kasia pointed to the pipe junction where she'd hidden the coded message. The small cavity was empty. Irina cursed under her breath. "When did you leave it here?" "Around midnight. Maybe a little after." The raid started at 2 in the morning. Irina's voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. Someone retrieved your message and used it to coordinate the attacks. Kasia felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her secure hiding place, her trusted route, her careful protocols, all of it had been compromised. But how? A sound echoed through the tunnel, footsteps, moving with purpose. Both women froze. This way, Irina breathed, pulling Kasia deeper into the network of passages. They ran through the darkness, their footsteps splashing through puddles of stagnant water. Behind them, the pursuing footsteps grew louder, more numerous. German voices bounced off the tunnel walls, distorted but unmistakably threatening. Irina led them through a series of turns that Kasia didn't recognize. These weren't the routes she'd been taught. They were older, narrower, carved from different stone. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere even I shouldn't know about," Irina replied grimly. But desperate times required desperate measures. They emerged through a hidden entrance in the basement of a bombed-out synagogue. Irina sealed the passage behind them with a section of false wall that looked like natural rubble. In the dim light filtering through broken windows above, Kasia could see the strain etched across Irina's face. "We have to assume everything is compromised," Irina said quietly. "Every route, every safe house, every contact you've ever used. Someone very close to our operation is feeding information to the Germans. But who? How do we find them?" Irina's smile held no warmth. "We're going to set a trap, and you, my dear, are going to be the bait." The stench hit Anna like a physical blow as she descended into the tunnel beneath Siena Street. Even after months of these journeys, her stomach still lurched at the mixture of raw sewage, decay, and something else, something that spoke of death, lingering too long in enclosed spaces. She pressed the damp cloth tighter against her nose and mouth, grateful for the small mercy of the peppermint oil Mrs. Kowalski had dabbed on it. Her fingers traced the familiar grooves in the brick wall as she moved deeper into the labyrinth. 27 paces straight, then left at the junction where someone had scratched a Star of David into the mortar. The resistance had their own map of this underworld, passed down through whispered instructions and memorized landmarks that meant nothing to the Nazi patrols above. The coded message felt heavy in the hidden pocket sewn into her coat's lining. 3 pages of what appeared to be her grandmother's traditional bread recipes, but Anna knew the truth hidden in the measurements and ingredients. Troop movements, guard rotations, the location of a planned deportation assembly point, information that could save hundreds of lives if she could deliver it safely to the safe house on Proster Street. Water dripped steadily from somewhere in the darkness ahead, each drop echoing like a metronome counting down the minutes until curfew. Anna quickened her pace, her boots splashing through the shallow stream that ran along the tunnel floor. The resistance had chosen her for these missions precisely because she was unremarkable. A skinny girl who could slip through spaces where grown men couldn't fit, who could navigate the maze of service tunnels that connected the ghetto to the Aryan side of Warsaw. The beam of her flashlight caught something that made her freeze. Footprints in the muddy sediment, far too fresh to be from her last passage 3 days ago. Large boots, military grade, with the distinctive tread pattern she'd learned to recognize. German patrols didn't venture into the sewers, they considered it beneath them, literally and figuratively. Which meant either the SS had changed their tactics, or someone had led them here. Anna's heart hammered against her ribs as she extinguished her light and pressed herself against the tunnel wall. In the absolute darkness, every sound became amplified. The scratch of rats' claws on stone, the distant rumble of vehicles on the street above, and something else, the soft scrape of fabric against brick coming from the direction she needed to go. She held her breath, counting seconds that stretched like hours. The sound came again, closer now, accompanied by the faint yellow glow of an approaching light. Anna looked desperately around the tunnel, but there was nowhere to hide. The junction that would take her toward Proster Street lay 30 meters ahead, past whoever was coming toward her. The voices reached her before she could see their owners. 2 men speaking in Polish, but something about their cadence felt wrong. Too careful, too practiced, like actors reciting familiar lines. "The girl should have passed through here by now," one voice said. "Kowalski promised she'd have the documents tonight." Anna's blood turned to ice water. Mrs. Kowalski's name in a stranger's mouth could only mean one thing: the elderly woman who had become like a grandmother to her, who had taught her the secret of hiding messages in plain sight. Mrs. Kowalski was either dead or had betrayed them all. "She'll come," the second voice replied. "These resistance rats always follow the same routes. No imagination." The light grew stronger, and Anna realized she had perhaps 30 seconds before they would see her. The maintenance ladder she'd passed 20 meters back was too far. The side tunnel that led to the old storm drain was blocked with debris. But there was another option, one that made her stomach clench with fear. The overflow pipe that ran parallel to the main tunnel was barely wide enough for her shoulders, and it led through a section that frequently flooded. But it would take her past the two men, emerging behind them near the junction she needed to reach. Anna dropped to her knees and squeezed through the narrow opening, biting back a cry as rusty metal scraped against her back. The pipe was even smaller than she'd remembered, forcing her to crawl on her belly through several inches of stagnant water that soaked through her clothes and filled her nose with a stench that made her eyes water. Behind her, the voices grew louder as the men reached the spot where she'd been standing moments before. She heard them stop, heard the splash of boots as they examined the area. Her own passage through the pipe was creating tiny ripples in the water below, and she prayed they wouldn't notice the disturbance. "Fresh tracks," one of them said. "She was here recently." Anna forced herself to keep moving, even as panic clawed at her chest. If Mrs. Kowalski had been compromised, then the entire network was in danger. Every safe house, every contact, every courier who had trusted the old woman's discretion. The message in Anna's coat might be the last warning they could send. The sewer tunnel stretched endlessly before Kasia, her fingers trailing along the slimy brick wall as she counted her steps in the darkness. 23, 24, 25. At 30, she would turn left into the main channel that ran beneath Nowolipie Street. The coded message felt like it was burning through the leather pouch pressed against her ribs, though she knew the sensation was only her imagination running wild with fear. 3 hours had passed since the disastrous meeting at the bakery. 3 hours since she'd watched Tomek's face crumple with the realization that someone in their cell had sold them out to the Germans. The image of those black boots stepping through the doorway haunted her as she navigated the labyrinth beneath Warsaw's streets, but she couldn't afford to think about that now. The message had to reach the Aryan side tonight, or 6 months of careful planning would be lost. The tunnel widened as she reached the junction, and Kasia paused to catch her breath. The stench down here was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, rotting garbage, and something else she preferred not to identify. She'd made this journey dozens of times, but tonight felt different. Tonight, every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. She pressed forward, her bare feet silent on the wet stone. The Germans knew about the tunnels, of course. They weren't stupid, but they also knew that sending soldiers into this maze was often a death sentence. Better to wait above ground and catch the rats when they surfaced. A splash echoed from somewhere behind her, and Kasia froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she strained to listen. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and somewhere far off she could hear the muffled rumble of a truck passing overhead. But there, another splash, closer this time. Someone was following her. Kasia's mind raced through the possibilities. It could be another courier, though she wasn't aware of anyone else scheduled to use this route tonight. It could be a desperate ghetto resident trying to escape, though few knew the exact paths through the sewer system. Or it could be someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. She thought of David's warning about trust, how he'd grabbed her arm and told her to be careful who she confided in. At the time, she'd assumed he was being paranoid. Now, as footsteps echoed through the darkness behind her, his words took on new meaning. Moving as quietly as possible, Kasia continued toward the checkpoint where the tunnel passed beneath the ghetto wall. The message in her pouch contained details of a planned ammunition transfer, locations, times, contact names. If it fell into German hands, it wouldn't just mean her death, it would mean the execution of everyone involved, along with their families. The footsteps behind her had grown more cautious, but they were definitely getting closer. Kasia reached a section where the tunnel branched in 3 directions and made a quick decision. Instead of taking the direct route to her destination, she veered left into a narrow passage that would loop back toward the ghetto. If someone was hunting her, she needed to know who it was before she led them straight to the resistance safe house. The side passage was barely wide enough for her shoulders, and she had to crouch as she moved through it. Behind her, the footsteps had stopped. Whoever was following her had reached the junction and was trying to decide which way she'd gone. Kasia pressed herself against the tunnel wall and waited. Minutes passed in absolute silence, and she began to wonder if she'd imagined the whole thing. Fear could play tricks on the mind, especially down here in the suffocating darkness where every nerve was already stretched to its breaking point. Then she heard voices, low, urgent whispers that seemed to float through the tunnels like ghosts. 2 people, maybe 3, speaking in hushed tones. Kasia strained to make out the words, but the echo and distance made it impossible. What she could determine, however, was that they were speaking German. Her blood turned to ice. Germans in the sewers meant only one thing. They knew exactly where she was supposed to go, and they were planning to be there waiting for her. The betrayal went deeper than just revealing the bakery as a meeting place. Someone had given them her entire route. Kasia closed her eyes and tried to think through her options. She could abandon the mission and return to the ghetto, but that would mean losing the ammunition transfer and leaving the resistance wondering what had happened to their courier. She could try to find an alternate route to the safe house, but the other paths she knew would add hours to her journey, and some were partially blocked by debris. Or she could assume that the safe house itself had been compromised and find another way to get the message across the city. The German voices were moving away now, heading in the direction of her original destination. Kasia waited until she could no longer hear them, then began making her way back through the narrow passage. She had an idea, dangerous and probably foolish, but it might be her only chance to complete the mission and warn the resistance about the extent of the betrayal they were facing. The acrid smell of sewage burned Mira's nostrils as she crouched in the tunnel, her heart hammering against her ribs. The coded message felt like it was burning through the fabric of her dress pocket, each second stretching into eternity as she waited for the patrol boots to fade overhead. The iron grate above her head filtered weak moonlight into broken patterns across the murky water that lapped at her ankles. She had been making these runs for 6 months now, slipping through the labyrinthine network beneath Warsaw with messages that could save lives or seal death warrants. Tonight felt different. The usual checkpoint guards had been replaced, and Tomasz's bakery had been searched twice in the past week. Someone was asking questions. When silence finally settled above, Mira began moving again, her fingers trailing along the familiar grooves in the tunnel wall that served as her map in the darkness. Left at the junction marked with 3 scratches, straight through the chamber where the ceiling leaked constantly, right where the old storm drain connected to the main sewer line. Each step brought her closer to the drop point, a loose brick in the foundation of a bombed-out church where Father Kowalski would retrieve her message before dawn. The water grew shallower as she approached the church section, and Mira allowed herself a moment of relief. Another successful run meant another group of children could be evacuated from the ghetto. Another cache of weapons could be moved to the safe house on Pilsudski Street. She thought of her younger brother David's face when she had last seen him through the bakery window, pressed against the glass with hollow cheeks, but still managing to smile when she waved. She reached for the loose brick, her fingers finding the familiar gap, when she heard voices echoing from the tunnel behind her. German voices, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. Impossible. No one else knew this route. She had been so careful, varying her timing, checking for tails, following every protocol Tomasz had drilled into her. Panic flooded her chest as she fumbled for the brick. finally pulling it free and shoving the message into the cavity. The voices were getting closer, accompanied by the splash of boots in shallow water and the yellow glow of flashlights dancing against tunnel walls. She replaced the brick with trembling hands and began moving toward the nearest exit, an emergency route that led to a basement on the edge of the Aryan Quarter. But as she rounded the corner, another light blazed to life directly ahead of her. A German soldier stood blocking the passage, his rifle trained on her chest. Behind her, the other voices had stopped, waiting. The trap was complete. "Fräulein," the soldier said in heavily accented Polish. "You are lost, perhaps?" Mira's mind raced through her cover story. She was searching for her cat that had fallen through a grate. She was hiding from the patrol that had been shooting at shadows in the alley above. She was sick and looking for somewhere to vomit privately. All the lies Tomasz had taught her seemed pathetic now, transparent as tissue paper. "I was trying to find food," she whispered, making her voice shake with fear that wasn't entirely fabricated. "My family is starving." The soldier studied her face in the harsh light, and she saw something there that chilled her more than the sewage water soaking through her shoes. Recognition. He knew exactly who she was and why she was there. "Search her," he called over his shoulder in German. As rough hands patted down her dress and found nothing, Mira's thoughts turned to the resistance network she had just potentially exposed. Father Kowalski would arrive at dawn expecting to find a message about the evacuation route. Instead, he would walk into a trap. The safe house locations, the contact names, the carefully planned escape routes, everything could unravel from this single thread. But something nagged at her as they zip-tied her hands behind her back. How had they known exactly where to wait? How had they found this specific tunnel when even the resistance had taken months to map the safe passages? The answer crept into her mind like ice water, bringing with it a realization that threatened to crush what remained of her hope. Someone had told them. Someone who knew the routes, the timing, the protocols. Someone who had access to the same information that Tomasz whispered to her in the pre-dawn darkness of the bakery kitchen. As they dragged her toward the surface, Mira tried to remember every detail of the past weeks. Who had been present when missions were planned? Who had asked casual questions about timing or routes? The faces of her fellow resistance members flickered through her memory, each one a potential betrayer, each one someone she had trusted with her life. The night air hit her face as they emerged from a drainage pipe into an alley she didn't recognize. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of trucks and the sharp bark of German commands preparing for dawn raids. Whatever information they had extracted from her capture was already being put to use. The sewer tunnel stretched before Kasia like a throat, waiting to swallow her whole. She pressed her back against the cold brick wall, listening to the echo of boots above. German patrols had tripled since yesterday's raid, their heavy footfalls a constant reminder that time was running out. The coded message hidden in her shoe felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. 3 resistance safe houses had been compromised in the past week, and this intelligence about the planned deportations had to reach the other side of the ghetto before dawn. But something felt wrong about tonight's mission from the moment Pavel had handed her the assignment. Water dripped steadily from somewhere in the darkness ahead. Kasia counted the drops, a habit she'd developed to calm her nerves during these underground journeys. 1, 2, 3. At 27, she heard voices. She froze. Voices in the sewers meant either lost souls seeking escape or something far more dangerous. The German soldiers rarely ventured down here, but their Polish collaborators had fewer scruples about crawling through filth for the right price. "Should be coming through here within the hour," a man's voice carried through the tunnel. Polish accent, but speaking German. Kasia's blood turned to ice. She recognized that voice. It belonged to Tomek, the baker who worked 3 stalls down from her family's shop, the man who always smiled at her mother and sometimes slipped extra flour into their rations when the German quotas left them short. "The girl is small, maybe 16 or 17, Tomek continued. Dark hair, usually wears a blue headscarf. She carries messages in her left shoe. Kasia's hand instinctively moved to her left foot. Only 3 people in the resistance knew about her hiding place for coded messages: Pavel, Mrs. Kowalski, and herself. Pavel had been the one to suggest the location months ago, claiming it was the safest spot because guards rarely checked shoes thoroughly. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Pavel, who had recruited her, who had taught her the routes through these tunnels, who had looked her in the eyes just 2 hours ago and wished her luck, had sold her out. "How much did they pay you?" another voice asked. This one was German, the accent thick and authoritative. "Enough to feed my family for a month," Tomek replied. "But I want the girl alive. She's just a child. That is not your concern. Your job is to identify her. Ours is to extract the information she carries." Kasia pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her mind racing. The tunnel ahead was the only route to her destination, but these men were clearly waiting in ambush. Going back would mean abandoning the mission, but the deportation information was too crucial to lose. Hundreds of lives hung in the balance. She thought of her younger brother, Jakub, probably asleep in their cramped apartment above the bakery, of Mrs. Kowalski, who had trusted her with increasingly dangerous assignments, of all the families who would be rounded up in tomorrow's operation if this warning didn't reach the resistance leaders. The sound of boots in water grew closer. They were moving toward her position. Kasia made her decision. She pulled off her left shoe and extracted the thin piece of paper hidden beneath the sole. The message was written in milk, invisible until heated, on what appeared to be a receipt for grain purchases. She memorized the coded numbers one final time, then slowly began tearing the paper into tiny pieces, letting them fall into the murky water flowing past her feet. If she was caught, they would find nothing. But the mission would die with her unless she could find another way. She heard the distinct sound of a safety being released on a pistol. Time was up. Moving as quietly as possible, Kasia began backing deeper into the side passage where she'd taken shelter. The tunnel was narrower here, built for drainage rather than human passage. She would have to crawl, but it might lead to another route she could take. Behind her, the voices grew more urgent. She should have come through by now. "Are you certain this is the right tunnel?" Pavel was specific about the route. Unless what? Unless she suspected something and turned back. Kasia's jaw clenched at the mention of Pavel's name. How long had he been feeding information to the Germans? How many other resistance members had walked into traps because of his betrayal? The urge to scream his name into the darkness was almost overwhelming. But she had work to do. The deportation schedule was burned into her memory now, and she would deliver that information if it killed her. She just needed to find another way across the ghetto. As she crawled deeper into the narrow drainage tunnel, feeling her way through the suffocating darkness, one thought sustained her. Pavel might have betrayed her location and her methods, but he couldn't betray her determination. The resistance had taught her to be resourceful, and tonight she would prove just how much she had learned. The voices faded behind her as she disappeared into the labyrinthine depths beneath Warsaw. The stench of sewage mingled with fear as Kasia pressed herself against the cold brick wall, listening to the echo of jackboots above. 3 sets, maybe 4, moving with the methodical precision that meant they were searching, not patrolling. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the oilskin packet containing tonight's coded messages, coordinates for a weapons drop that could arm 50 resistance fighters. She'd been in these tunnels for 2 hours, longer than any previous mission. The route that should have taken her 40 minutes to traverse had become a maze of wrong turns and blocked passages. Someone had been down here recently, moving stones, redirecting the chalk marks that guided couriers through the labyrinth. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone. This wasn't coincidence. Above her, a guttural voice barked orders in German. Kasia didn't need to understand the language to know they were coordinating a search. The betrayal she'd suspected 3 days ago, when the Gestapo had appeared at the Kowalski safe house just minutes after her departure, was no longer a suspicion. The boots moved away, but Kasia remained frozen. In the distance, she could hear the splash of someone wading through the shallow water that ran along the main tunnel floor. They were below ground now, coming for her. She thought of Tomek's face when she'd told him about her suspicions. His dismissal had been too quick, too forceful. "You're paranoid, Kasia. The stress is getting to you." But stress didn't explain how the Germans always seemed to arrive just after the couriers had passed through. It didn't explain the subtle changes in routes that left runners exposed and vulnerable. A beam of light swept past her hiding spot, illuminating the grimy tunnel walls. Kasia held her breath and pressed deeper into the narrow alcove she'd discovered, a maintenance shaft that barely accommodated her small frame. The light passed again, closer this time, accompanied by the careful footsteps of someone who knew these tunnels well, too well. When the figure emerged from the shadows, Kasia's world tilted. Marek, one of their most trusted runners, moved through the tunnel with the confidence of someone following a familiar path. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 SS officers followed, their weapons drawn but relaxed, the posture of men who knew they weren't walking into danger. Marek stopped directly in front of her hiding place and spoke in perfect German. She should be along this route. The bakery girl always uses the Eastern Passage on Thursdays. The casual way he said bakery girl hit Kasia like a physical blow. Marek had been with the resistance for 8 months. He'd shared meals with them, celebrated their small victories, mourned their losses. She'd trusted him with her life dozens of times. "Your information has been valuable," one of the Germans replied. "When this network falls, your compensation will reflect your service to the Reich." Kasia's hands shook as the implications crashed over her. Marek knew everyone, safe houses, drop points, courier routes, the entire structure of their cell. He could give the Germans everything. The group moved past her alcove, and Kasia waited until their voices faded before emerging. Her mind raced through the possibilities. She could complete her mission, deliver the weapons coordinates, and hope the cell could be warned in time. But Marek would be there when she arrived, ready to spring whatever trap he'd prepared. Or she could turn back, abandon the mission, and race to warn the others. But without the weapons those coordinates represented, the resistance attack planned for next week would fail. Dozens of fighters would be captured or killed in a hopeless assault. The sound of approaching voices made the decision for her. More Germans coming from the direction she'd entered. They'd sealed both ends of the tunnel. Kasia pulled out her small knife and cut open the oilskin packet. The coded message was written on thin rice paper in washable ink, standard precautions against capture. She memorized the coordinates, then held the paper under the trickle of water that seeped through the tunnel ceiling until the ink dissolved completely. Taking a shuddering breath, she began to move deeper into the tunnels, away from both groups of searchers. She knew of one route Marek had never used, a passage so narrow and dangerous that it was reserved for absolute emergencies. The tunnel led through a section where the ceiling had partially collapsed, creating a crawl space barely wider than her shoulders. It was unstable, prone to cave-ins, and it emerged dangerously close to a German checkpoint. But it would get her to the bakery district, where she could contact Pavel, one of the few resistance members who worked independently of their main cell. If anyone could get word to the other groups about Marek's betrayal, it would be him. As she squeezed into the narrow passage, loose dirt raining down on her head, Kasia wondered how many others would die before this night was over. The resistance had survived German bullets and torture, but trust, once broken, might prove impossible to rebuild. The sewer tunnel stretched endlessly before Anya, each step echoing like gunshots in the confined space. Her breathing came in short, ragged gasps as she clutched the leather satchel containing the coded messages. Behind her, somewhere in the labyrinth of tunnels, she could hear the distant splash of boots through murky water. They were gaining ground. She had memorized this route months ago, but panic made every turn feel foreign. Left at the junction marked with 3 scratches, straight through the chamber where rats scurried across rusted pipes, right where the tunnel narrowed so severely she had to turn sideways to pass through. The betrayal burned in her chest worse than the stitch in her side. Samuel's face kept flashing before her eyes, the way he had looked at her when she'd announced the mission details at yesterday's meeting. She had thought it was concern for her safety. Now she understood it had been guilt. Water seeped through the worn soles of her boots, and the cold worked its way up her legs. The messages in her satchel were wrapped in oiled cloth, but she wondered how long they would stay dry in this underground hell. Names, locations, planned operations, everything the resistance needed to evacuate their safe houses and relocate their weapons caches. If these messages didn't reach their destination, dozens of people would walk into Nazi traps. A distant shout echoed through the tunnels, followed by the harsh beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness behind her. Anya pressed herself against the slimy brick wall and tried to quiet her breathing. The patrol was closer than she had hoped. She thought of Samuel again, remembering how he had joined their cell 6 months ago. He had seemed so eager, so committed to the cause. He had even volunteered for dangerous missions, though they had always assigned him to safer tasks, watching for patrols, gathering supplies, maintaining equipment. Had that been his strategy all along? To seem invaluable while staying in positions where he could observe without arousing suspicion? The flashlight beam grew stronger. Anya forced herself to move, splashing as quietly as possible through ankle-deep water that reeked of waste and decay. Her destination was still 3 turns away, a hidden entrance that opened into the basement of a bombed-out synagogue. From there, she could reach the safe house where David and the others were waiting for the intelligence. But first, she had to survive the next 10 minutes. The tunnel ahead split into 2 passages. Anya paused, trying to remember the correct path. In her panic, the landmarks blurred together. She closed her eyes and pictured the crude map David had drawn for her, counting the turns from the bakery entrance. Left passage. It had to be the left. She was halfway down the narrow corridor when she heard voices from the tunnel behind her. Not German, Polish. Her blood ran cold as she recognized one of them. Samuel's voice, speaking in hushed tones to someone else. He was leading them directly to her. The passage opened into a wider chamber where several tunnels converged. Anya looked desperately for another route, but there was nowhere to hide. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. In moments, they would have her cornered. Then she spotted it, a maintenance ladder leading up to a heavy iron grate. She grabbed the rusted rungs and climbed as quickly as she dared, her wet hands slipping on the corroded metal. The grate was locked from above, but years of water damage had weakened the hinges. She pushed with all her strength, feeling it give slightly. Below, flashlight beams began to penetrate the chamber. Anya gave the grate one final desperate shove. It swung open with a shriek of protesting metal, and she hauled herself through the opening into blessed darkness. She found herself in the rubble-strewn basement of a destroyed building. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the collapsed ceiling above. The sounds from the sewer were muffled now, but she could still hear Samuel's voice directing the search. How long before they found the maintenance ladder? Anya clutched the satchel and tried to orient herself. The bombed synagogue should be 2 blocks east, but in this landscape of destruction, every building looked the same. She picked her way carefully through the debris, staying low and avoiding the patches of moonlight that could betray her position. As she moved, a terrible thought occurred to her. Samuel knew about the synagogue entrance. He knew about the safe house. He might know about David's planned meeting with the Polish underground tomorrow night. How much had they told him? How much damage had they already done by trusting him? She had to reach David before Samuel's handlers could act on whatever information he had provided. The messages in her satchel were important, but warning the resistance about the betrayal was a matter of life and death for everyone involved. Anya emerged from the ruined building and began running through the shadows toward what she hoped was salvation. The basement beneath Kowalski's abandoned butcher shop reeked of rotting meat and fear. Kasia pressed her back against the damp brick wall, watching as Tomek paced the narrow space like a caged wolf. 3 other resistance members sat hunched around a flickering candle, their faces carved into shadows by the weak light. Someone told them exactly where to wait, Tomek said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Germans weren't patrolling randomly. They knew. Kasia's stomach churned as she remembered the soldiers emerging from the tunnel entrance like they had been expecting her. If she hadn't noticed the glint of a rifle barrel in the moonlight, she would have walked straight into their trap. "Maybe they followed one of us," suggested Marek, a thin boy who couldn't be older than 16. His hands shook as he spoke. "No." Anya's voice cut through the speculation with surgical precision. The middle-aged woman had been coordinating resistance activities for months, and her instincts had kept them all alive. This was planned. Someone gave them our route, our timing, everything. The candle flame danced, casting writhing shadows across their faces. Kasia studied each person in the circle, searching for any sign of guilt or deception. These people had become her family over the past months. The thought that one of them might be responsible for nearly getting her killed made her feel sick. Who knew about tonight's mission? Anya continued, her grey eyes moving methodically from person to person. "All of us," Tomek replied. "Plus whoever gave you the message to begin with." Anya's jaw tightened. "Dr. Brennan from the American Joint Distribution Committee. He's been feeding US intelligence for weeks." "And the route?" Kasia found her voice. "I chose that myself, but I told several people which entrance I planned to use." She paused, remembering. "Including Pavel." The name hung in the air like smoke. Pavel had been part of their group for only a few weeks, brought in by someone who vouched for his commitment to the cause. He was older than most of them, perhaps 30, with the weathered hands of someone who had worked manual labor his entire life. "Where is Pavel tonight?" Anya asked. No one answered immediately. Kasia realized she hadn't seen him since 2 days ago when they had planned tonight's operation. At the time, his absence hadn't seemed significant. People disappeared from meetings regularly, sometimes because they were sick, sometimes because they were dead. He said he had to visit his sister. Marek offered weakly. Said she was ill. "What sister?" Tomek's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Pavel told me his entire family was killed in the first deportations. The implications crashed over them like ice water." Kasia felt her breathing become shallow as pieces of information rearranged themselves in her mind. Pavel asking detailed questions about tunnel routes. Pavel always volunteering to take messages to other resistance cells. Pavel's convenient absences when operations went wrong. "We have to assume he knows everything," Anya said grimly. "Every safe house, every contact, every planned operation. Then we're finished," Marek whispered. "No." Kasia stood up, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "We adapt. We change everything he knows about, and we find him before he can do more damage." Tomek looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You nearly walked into his trap tonight. Are you sure you want to hunt him down?" Kasia thought about her father, somewhere in the ghetto, believing she was safely learning to bake bread. She thought about the families depending on the medicines and information she carried through the tunnels. She thought about the fear in Marek's eyes and the exhaustion in Anya's face. "I'm sure." Anya nodded slowly. "Pavel knows our usual meeting places, but there's one location he's never been to. My grandmother's apartment on Nowolipie Street. The building was damaged in the bombing, but the cellar is intact." "When?" Tomek asked. "Tomorrow night. Spread the word carefully, only to people you trust completely. We'll reorganize everything from there." As they prepared to leave, moving out one at a time to avoid drawing attention, Anya caught Kasia's arm. "You showed courage tonight, but what we're planning next will be more dangerous than anything you've done before. If Pavel has been reporting to the Germans, they'll be watching for us to retaliate. Are you prepared for that?" Kasia met the older woman's gaze steadily. 6 months ago, she had been worried about burning loaves of bread and avoiding her father's lectures about staying out of trouble. Now, she was planning to hunt down a traitor who could destroy everyone she cared about. "I'm ready," she said, and discovered that she meant it. The candle guttered out, plunging them into darkness. Above them, the city slept fitfully under its blanket of occupation and fear. unaware that in basement hideouts and ruined cellars, a few determined people were planning their next move in a war that would determine whether hope or despair would ultimately triumph. The candlelight flickered against the brick walls as Kasia descended into the main chamber beneath Nowolipie Street, her heart hammering against her ribs. The coded message from Dr. Korczak burned in her memory. 3 resistance cells had been compromised, their members arrested in coordinated raids that could only mean one thing. Someone with intimate knowledge of their operations was feeding information to the Nazis. Around the rough wooden table, familiar faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from hope to desperation. Jacob's weathered hands trembled slightly as he traced patterns in the dust. Sarah clutched a torn piece of fabric, all that remained of her husband's shirt after his arrest 2 days prior. Even Tomasz, usually unshakable, bore new lines of worry etched deep around his eyes. "The doctor confirmed it," Kasia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The raids weren't random. They knew exactly where to find our people, when they would be there, what routes they used." She paused, studying each face in the amber glow. "We have a traitor among us." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Sarah's quiet sob echoed off the walls, while Jakob's fist clenched and unclenched rhythmically. Tomasz leaned back against the brick, his eyes closed as if trying to ward off the reality of her words. "How can you be certain?" asked Miriam, the newest member of their cell, her youthful face pale in the dim light. She had joined them only 3 weeks ago, recommended by a contact in the Aryan quarter who vouched for her dedication to the cause. Kasia pulled the small piece of paper from her shoe, smoothing it carefully on the table. Dr. Korczak intercepted German communications. They referenced specific details, code names, meeting times, even the location of the weapons cache on Lesno Street. Her throat tightened. Information that only someone in our inner circle would possess. The implications hung heavy in the stale air. For months, they had trusted each other with their lives, sharing secrets that could mean death if discovered. Now that trust lay shattered, leaving them vulnerable and isolated even within their own group. "What about the Courier network?" Jakob finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Could someone have overheard our conversations, pieced together enough information to—" "No." Tomasz opened his eyes, fixing each of them with an intense stare. "The Germans knew about the emergency signal we established last month. Only the 5 of us were present when we agreed on it." His words carried the weight of certainty none of them wanted to acknowledge. Kasia watched their faces carefully, searching for any telltale sign of guilt or nervousness. Sarah's grief seemed genuine. Her husband's arrest had left her devastated and barely functional. Jakob had lost his own son to the resistance. Betraying the cause would dishonor that sacrifice. Tomasz had been with them from the beginning, his commitment proven through countless dangerous missions. That left Miriam, whose recommendation had come through channels they couldn't fully verify. Yet the young woman's dedication seemed sincere, her willingness to take risks evident in her volunteer work, smuggling food to the most desperate families. "We need to consider every possibility," Kasia said slowly. "Could any of our contacts on the outside have been compromised? Someone who might have been forced to give up information under interrogation? Forced or willing?" Jakob muttered bitterly. "The result is the same." Sarah looked up from her grief-stricken contemplation. "What about the baker? Your employer has access to your movements, knows when you're making runs through the tunnels." Kasia felt a chill run down her spine. Pan Kowalski had indeed shown increasing nervousness lately, asking pointed questions about her absences and seeming overly interested in her activities outside the bakery. But he had also provided cover for her resistance work, even supplied bread for starving families without asking for payment. "I've considered that," she admitted, "but he's taken risks to help us. Why would he betray the very people he's been protecting?" "Fear," Tomasz said simply. "Or family pressure. The Nazis are skilled at finding leverage over good people, forcing them to make impossible choices." Miriam shifted uncomfortably. "So what do? We can't continue operating if we don't know who to trust." "We set a trap," Kasia said, the plan forming even as she spoke. We feed different information to each suspect, false but believable intelligence about planned operations. Then we see which details make their way to the Germans. The others nodded grimly, understanding the necessity even as they recoiled from the deception it required. Trust had been their greatest weapon against the oppression surrounding them. Now they would have to sacrifice it to survive. "And if we discover the traitor among us?" Sarah asked quietly. Tomasz's expression hardened. "Then we do what must be done to protect the others." His meaning was unmistakable. In their world, betrayal carried only one possible consequence. Kasia felt the weight of leadership settling heavier on her shoulders as she looked around the table at these people who had become her second family. The acrid smell of smoke drifted through the broken window as Kasia pressed herself against the cold brick wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 floors below, Wehrmacht boots echoed in methodical patterns across the courtyard. She had been hiding in the abandoned apartment for nearly 2 hours, clutching the decoded message that revealed the scope of Marcus's betrayal. The resistance safe houses, the weapons caches, the planned escape routes. He had given the Nazis everything. Worse still, tomorrow's supply run was a trap designed to capture what remained of their network. 15 people, including Dr. Kowalski and young Tomek, would walk directly into SS hands unless she could warn them. But first, she had to survive the night. A door slammed somewhere in the building, followed by harsh German voices. They were conducting a systematic search, floor by floor. Kasia's mind raced through her options. The main stairwell was compromised, and the fire escape had collapsed weeks ago during the last bombing. That left only one route, the narrow gap between buildings that led to the adjacent tenement's roof. She crept toward the window, glass crunching beneath her worn shoes despite her efforts to move silently. The gap was barely 3 feet wide, but it was a 4-story drop to the alley below. In the darkness, she could just make out the ledge on the opposite building. Voices grew louder in the hallway outside. The systematic search had reached her floor. Kasia swung one leg over the windowsill, then the other, until she was perched on the narrow ledge. The wind whipped through the canyon between buildings, carrying the distant sound of sirens and the ever-present smell of burning. She pressed her back against the wall and began sliding sideways toward the adjacent building, her fingers finding purchase in the crumbling mortar between bricks. Behind her, Boots entered the apartment she had just vacated. A flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating the window where she had stood moments before. Kasia held her breath and pressed herself deeper into the shadows. The beam moved away, but the voices remained. They were arguing about something in rapid German, too fast for her limited vocabulary to follow. She needed to keep moving. The ledge narrowed as she approached the corner of the building. Here, where the structures nearly touched, decades of weather had worn away chunks of masonry. Her left foot found only air where the ledge should have been. Fighting panic, she stretched her right leg toward the opposite building. Her toe touched solid stone. With a leap of faith that felt like falling, she pushed off from the crumbling ledge and threw herself across the gap. Her knees struck the opposite wall hard enough to bring tears to her eyes, but her fingers found the window frame and held tight. She hauled herself through the broken window just as shouts erupted from the building behind her. Flashlight beams danced across the walls as soldiers discovered the open window and realized their quarry had escaped. This building felt different, emptier, colder. The Nazis had cleared it weeks ago, relocating its residents to the packed tenements near the ghetto center. Kasia moved through the abandoned apartments like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by debris and fallen plaster. She found the stairs and began her descent, pausing at each landing to listen for sounds of pursuit. The coded message crinkled in her pocket, proof of Marcus's treachery, but also her death warrant if the wrong people found it. At the ground floor, she located the building's coal cellar. Like most structures in this district, it connected to the old utility tunnels that ran beneath the streets. These weren't the main sewers she knew so well, but a network of steam pipes and electrical conduits that had serviced the neighborhood before the war. The entrance was hidden behind a false wall of coal bins. Kasia felt along the edges until she found the loose board that swung inward on hidden hinges. The space beyond was barely wide enough for her shoulders, but it would take her beneath the streets and away from the soldiers above. She squeezed through the opening and found herself in a narrow tunnel lined with rusted pipes. The air was thick and stifling, heavy with the smell of coal dust and decay, but it was safe for now. Moving in a crouch, she followed the tunnel as it curved away from the building. Her destination was the old synagogue on Świętojańska Street, one of the few resistance meeting points that Marcus didn't know about. If she could reach Rabbi Goldstein before dawn, he could get word to the others about tomorrow's trap. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, her only light the faint glow filtering through occasional grates in the street above. Each step took her deeper into the underground maze that had become her second home. Behind her, the sounds of the search grew fainter. But she knew the hunt was far from over. The echo of running water masked Mira's ragged breathing as she pressed herself against the curved brick wall of the main sewer tunnel. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat seeming loud enough to betray her location to anyone listening above. The coded message from Dr. Korczak's network burned in her memory. 3 safe houses compromised, evacuation routes discovered, dozens of lives hanging by threads that grew more frayed with each passing hour. She had to reach the Aryan side before dawn, but the route Stefan had given her felt wrong. Too easy, too convenient. The doubt that had been gnawing at her since discovering the Wehrmacht patrol schedules in his quarters now consumed her thoughts like acid. Every shadow could hide a trap, every sound could signal betrayal. The tunnel ahead curved toward the outlet near Grzybowski Square, exactly where Stefan had directed her. Mira stopped, her baker's instincts screaming warnings she couldn't ignore. Just as burnt edges on bread revealed overheating ovens, small details here suggested something was terribly wrong. The tunnel was too clean, debris cleared from the path as if someone had prepared it. Fresh scratches on the walls indicated recent passage, not by desperate refugees, but by heavy boots. Mira turned back, choosing instead the flooded passage that led toward the textile district. The water reached her waist, icy and foul, carrying the detritus of a dying city. Each step required monumental effort, but she pushed forward, following a mental map drawn from months of dangerous journeys beneath Warsaw's streets. A distant splash froze her blood, footsteps in water, deliberate and measured, multiple sets. They were following her, had been tracking her since she left the ghetto tunnel entrance. Stefan's betrayal ran deeper than she had imagined. He hadn't just compromised safe houses, he had orchestrated a trap using her as bait. The realization struck her with crushing force. Her previous missions, the ones that had felt suspiciously successful, the German patrols that seemed to miss her by mere minutes, all of it had been theater. Stefan had been feeding information to the Nazis, while simultaneously allowing small victories to maintain his cover. He had been playing a longer game, waiting for the resistance to trust her with something truly valuable. Tonight was that night. The message she carried contained not just evacuation routes, but the locations of every major resistance cell in the Warsaw district. Dr. Korczak's network, the weapons cache beneath the old synagogue, the printing press operation in the basement of the ruined hospital, all of it was in her head, waiting to be extracted by whatever methods the Gestapo preferred. Mira forced herself deeper into the flooding passage, feeling for the iron ladder that led to a forgotten maintenance shaft. Her fingers found the rusted rungs, just as lights appeared behind her, sweeping beams that cut through the darkness like searchlights hunting prey. Voices echoed off the tunnel walls, speaking in German, coordinated and professional. She hauled herself up the ladder, muscles screaming from the effort. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders, but it led to an abandoned section of the pre-war municipal system. If she could reach the old coal delivery tunnels, she might still escape to warn the others. The ladder rungs bit into her palms, each one a victory measured in inches. Above, a rusty grate blocked her path, sealed by years of neglect. Mira braced her back against the shaft wall and pushed with her legs, feeling the metal strain and shift. The voices below grew louder. They had found the ladder. The grate gave way suddenly, sending her tumbling onto a pile of ancient coal dust in what had once been a storage cellar. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her scraped knees, and ran toward the pale rectangle of light that marked a basement window. Behind her, heavy boots rang against ladder rungs. They were close now, close enough that she could hear their breathing, their muttered coordination. Stefan's betrayal had been thorough, but it had one flaw. He didn't know about the coal tunnels. That knowledge came from her father, from stories of his youth working in these same basements before the war transformed Warsaw into a charnel house. Mira squeezed through the window into an alley that reeked of garbage and human waste. The ghetto walls loomed to her left, but ahead lay the maze of bombed buildings that formed the boundary between territories. If she could reach the safe house on Świętojanska Street, if Tomasz was still alive, if the cell hadn't already been compromised, she might still salvage something from this disaster. The first shots echoed behind her as she ran, muzzle flashes lighting the alley like deadly fireworks. Stefan's German friends had found the window. But Mira knew these streets better than any collaborator, better than any occupying force. She ran toward whatever remained of hope in a city where betrayal had become another form of currency and survival another word for resistance. The warehouse basement reeked of damp concrete and betrayal. Anna pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering as she watched Stefan pace before the assembled resistance members. In the flickering candlelight, his familiar face looked foreign, twisted with something she'd never seen before. "The girl knows too much," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "She's become a liability we can't afford." Anna's breath caught in her throat. They were talking about her. The man who had trained her, who had praised her courage in the sewers, who had become like an older brother. He was advocating for her death. Tomek shifted uncomfortably on his wooden crate. "Stefan, she's just a child, and she's proven herself dozens of times. A child who's compromised our entire operation." Stefan's hand moved to the pistol at his waist. "The Gestapo didn't just stumble onto our meeting yesterday. Someone led them there, someone who knew exactly where we'd be." The accusation hit Anna like a physical blow. She wanted to burst from her hiding place behind the supply shelves, to scream her innocence, but Jakub's earlier warning echoed in her mind. "Trust no one. Not until we know who the real traitor is. You have proof?" This from Marta, the nurse whose steady hands had patched up countless wounded fighters. Stefan reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "I found this in her satchel during the confusion yesterday. Look at it." Anna squinted through the shadows, her blood running cold as she recognized her own handwriting. It was a map of the sewer routes, but not one she remembered drawing. The tunnels were wrong, the safe houses marked incorrectly. Someone had forged her hand, creating evidence of betrayal where none existed. "She's been feeding them information for weeks," Stefan continued, his lie delivered with practiced conviction. "How else do you explain the increased patrols, the blocked tunnels, the fact that 3 of our safe houses have been raided in the past month?" Anna's mind raced. Those incidents had puzzled everyone, but she'd assumed it was bad luck, the natural tightening of Nazi control. Now she saw the pattern differently. Someone had been sabotaging their operations systematically, and Stefan was using her as the scapegoat. But why? What did he gain from destroying the network he'd helped build? The answer came with horrifying clarity as she noticed the way Stefan kept glancing toward the basement's far corner, where a small radio sat hidden behind flour sacks. A German radio, she realized, the kind used for transmitting, not receiving. Stefan wasn't just betraying them to save himself, he was actively working for the Gestapo. Tomek stood slowly, his weathered face creased with anguish. "If this is true, if Anna has been compromising our people—" "It is true," Stefan said firmly. "And we all know what has to be done. The resistance cannot survive if we show mercy to traitors." Murmurs rippled through the small group. Anna saw heads beginning to nod, saw the doubt and anger building in faces that had once looked at her with affection and respect. Stefan's manipulation was working perfectly. She had to act. Staying hidden would only confirm her guilt in their eyes when they eventually found her. Taking a shaking breath, Anna stepped out from behind the shelves. The room went dead silent. "It's a lie," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Stefan is the traitor." Stefan's hand moved instantly to his weapon, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He was too smart for that, too aware that turning violent immediately would confirm her accusation. "Anna," he said with perfectly crafted sorrow, "I know this must be difficult, but denying it will only make things worse." "Look at the radio," Anna said, pointing to the corner. "That's how he's been communicating with them. That's how they knew about yesterday." Several heads turned, and Anna saw understanding begin to dawn on Marta's face. The nurse had medical training, attention to detail that others might miss. "That radio wasn't here last week," Marta said slowly. "I would have noticed it when I was treating Pavel's wounds." Stefan's composure cracked slightly. "The radio is for our own communications. German frequency markers," Tomek interrupted, having moved closer to examine it. "This is Wehrmacht equipment." The tension in the room shifted like a physical force. Suddenly, Stefan was the one facing suspicious stares, and Anna saw him calculating odds, planning his next move. "You're all fools," he said, dropping his pretense entirely. "The Reich has already won. I chose the winning side." His hand finally moved to his pistol, but Tomek was faster. The older man's knife took Stefan in the chest before the gun cleared its holster. As Stefan collapsed, gasping, Anna felt no satisfaction, only a hollow sadness. Another friend lost, another betrayal to carry. But the network would survive, and tomorrow there would be more messages to carry through the dark tunnels beneath the city. The resistance endured, even when trust became the most dangerous luxury of all. The candlelight flickered against the damp brick walls as Mira descended into the tunnels one last time. Her hands trembled as she clutched the leather satchel containing the final coded messages, evacuation routes, safe house locations, and the names of every resistance member still alive in the ghetto. The weight of it felt heavier than any burden she had carried before. 3 days had passed since she discovered Tomas's betrayal, 3 days of careful planning and desperate preparation. The Nazis would strike tomorrow at dawn, their informant having provided them with enough intelligence to dismantle the entire network. But Mira had one advantage they didn't expect. She knew about the betrayal, and she had a plan. The sewers that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a tomb. Every echo of her footsteps seemed amplified, every shadow potentially hiding German soldiers. She had memorized the route to the Christian quarter where Jan waited with false papers and a truck. From there, the surviving resistance members could scatter across the countryside, disappearing into the forests where partisan groups operated. As she navigated the familiar turns, Mira's mind wandered to her family's bakery. Now nothing but rubble and ash. Her parents, her younger brother David, the warmth of fresh bread in the early morning hours, all of it existed only in memory now. The girl who had once worried about perfectly kneaded dough and rising times had died in these tunnels, replaced by someone harder, someone capable of making impossible choices. A splash echoed from somewhere behind her. Mira froze, pressing herself against the tunnel wall. The sound came again, deliberate footsteps moving through the ankle-deep water. Someone was following her. She extinguished her candle and moved forward in complete darkness, her fingers trailing along the rough brick to guide her way. The footsteps behind her quickened, no longer attempting stealth. Her heart hammered as she broke into a run, the satchel bouncing against her hip with each stride. The tunnel branched ahead, and she veered left toward the old maintenance shaft that would take her up to street level. Behind her, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the churning water where her feet disturbed the surface. German voices echoed off the walls, harsh and commanding. They had found her route. Mira's lungs burned as she climbed the rusted ladder rungs, the metal slick with condensation and decades of neglect. The voices below grew louder, more urgent. She could hear them splashing through the water, their heavy boots creating a rhythm of pursuit that matched her racing pulse. At the surface, she pushed against the heavy manhole cover, her muscles straining until it shifted enough for her to squeeze through. The night air hit her face like a blessing, cool and clean after the suffocating atmosphere below. She was in an alley behind a bombed-out church, exactly where she had planned to emerge. Jan's truck idled at the far end of the alley, its engine a low rumble in the darkness. She could see his silhouette in the driver's seat, and beyond him, the huddled forms of other resistance members who had already made their escape from the ghetto. Mrs. Kowalski, who had hidden weapons in her flour sacks. Piotr, barely 16, who had served as a lookout for months. Father Nowak, whose sermons had carried coded warnings to the faithful. They were so close to safety. The manhole cover behind her erupted upward as the first German soldier emerged from the tunnels. Mira sprinted toward the truck, the satchel clutched against her chest. Gunshots cracked through the night air, bullets sparking off the cobblestones around her feet. "Go!" she screamed at Jan as she reached the truck's tailgate. "Drive!" But even as the engine roared to life and the truck lurched forward, Mira knew she wouldn't make it. More soldiers were pouring from the tunnel, and others were rounding the corners of the alley, sealing off their escape route. The trap was closing with military precision. Jan's eyes met hers through the rear window of the truck cab, filled with anguish and understanding. She pressed the satchel against the tailgate as the vehicle accelerated past her, watching as Piotr's young hands reached out to grab it. The coded messages were safe. The network would survive, scattered but intact. Mira stopped running. There was nowhere left to go, and she was tired of being afraid. She turned to face the approaching soldiers, standing straight despite the rifles pointed at her chest. In the distance, she could hear Jan's truck disappearing into the maze of Warsaw's streets, carrying the last hope of the resistance to safety. The teenage baker's apprentice, who had once feared burning bread, now waited calmly for whatever came next, knowing that some ovens burned away everything except the truth. And the truth was simple. They had not broken her, and they never would. The night closed around them all. The safe house felt like a tomb as Kasia faced the circle of resistance fighters, their eyes burning with accusation and desperation. Samuel stood behind her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, but even his presence couldn't shield her from the weight of their collective fury. 3 operations compromised, spat Henrik, the grizzled former soldier who coordinated weapons smuggling. 12 of our people arrested or dead, and you want us to believe it's coincidence that every failed mission had one common thread? I never betrayed anyone, Kasia said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I've risked my life dozens of times for this cause. Have you? The question came from Anna, the soft-spoken teacher who ran the children's safe passage network. Her usually kind eyes were cold as winter stones. Or have you been playing a longer game, earning our trust before delivering us all to the Nazis? Dr. Kowalski stepped forward from the shadows, his medical bag clutched in his arthritic fingers. I've seen what they do to suspected resistance members in their cells. The torture, the interrogation techniques. Perhaps Kasia was compromised weeks ago and has been feeding them information ever since. The accusation hit Kasia like a physical blow. These people had become her family, the only family she had left after her parents disappeared into the ghetto's nightmare. The thought that they could believe her capable of such betrayal made her chest tighten with grief. Show them, Samuel said quietly. Kasia hesitated, then rolled up her sleeves, revealing the network of scars covering her forearms. Burns from hiding in the bakery ovens during raids, cuts from crawling through broken glass in the sewers, the infected wound on her wrist where a Nazi patrol dog had caught her during her escape 2 nights ago. These are from serving the resistance, she said. Every mark is proof of my loyalty. Scars can be fabricated, Henrik muttered, but his voice carried less conviction now. Can they? Dr. Kowalski moved closer, his trained eye examining the wounds. These injuries showed progressive healing over months. The infection patterns are consistent with sewer contamination, The burns matched the temperature signatures of industrial ovens. He straightened, his expression troubled. These wounds tell the story of someone who has been genuinely living this dangerous life. Anna's hostility wavered. Then how do you explain the pattern? Every mission you touched turned into a trap. Before Kasia could respond, footsteps echoed from the stairwell outside. Everyone froze, hands moving instinctively to concealed weapons. The coded knock came 3 short, 2 long, 1 short, but the rhythm felt wrong, too hurried. Samuel moved to the window, peering through the blackout curtains. His face went pale. German patrol, 2 blocks away and moving this direction. Impossible, whispered Anna. This location is clean. No one outside this room knows about it. The terrible realization dawned on Kasia like a physical weight settling on her shoulders. She looked around the circle of faces, seeing her own growing understanding reflected in their eyes. The betrayer isn't someone who's been feeding information to the Nazis, she said slowly. It's someone who's been working with them all along, someone who's been part of the resistance since the beginning, with access to everything. Henrik's hand moved toward his pistol. What are you saying? I'm saying that whoever arranged for me to be blamed is probably the same person who's been systematically destroying our network. Kasia's mind raced through the connections, the pattern she'd missed before. Someone who knew which missions I'd be involved in, who could ensure that those specific operations would fail while others succeeded. The patrol's voices grew closer, harsh German commands echoing off the narrow street walls. Dr. Kowalski clutched his medical bag tighter, and Kasia noticed something that made her blood freeze. The bag's leather was too clean, too well maintained for someone supposedly living in the ghetto squalor. The brass clasps gleamed despite the building's dim light. And there, barely visible beneath his sleeve, she caught a glimpse of a watch far too expensive for a physician treating resistance fighters for free. "Doctor," she said carefully, "how did you know about this meeting location?" His eyes met hers, and in that instant she saw the truth. Not guilt or shame, but cold calculation and a hint of relief that the pretense was finally ending. "Very observant," he said, his voice carrying a different tone now, harder and more precise. Though unfortunately a bit too late. The patrol sounds stopped directly outside the building. In the sudden silence, they could hear boots on the stairs, moving with the confidence of soldiers who knew exactly where they were going. Samuel reached for Kasia's hand, squeezing it once before moving toward the room's only other exit, a window leading to the fire escape. But Dr. Kowalski was already blocking their path, and his medical bag was open, revealing not surgical instruments, but a German military radio, its antenna extended and ready. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "that none of you will be leaving this room." The stench of the sewers had become so familiar that Anna barely noticed it anymore as she pressed her back against the cold brick wall, listening to the echo of jackboots above. 3 days had passed since she'd discovered Tomek's treachery, 3 days of careful planning and calculated risks. The resistance cell had scattered like roaches in lamplight after she'd delivered the news, but not before Jakob had given her one final mission. She clutched the leather satchel closer to her chest, feeling the weight of the evidence inside. Documents, photographs, and most crucially, the wireless radio logs that proved Tomek had been feeding information to SS Oberfuhrer Kruger for months. Every raid, every capture, every young fighter who'd simply vanished, all of it traced back to the boy she'd once shared stolen kisses with behind the bakery ovens. The boots moved away, and Anna counted to 60 before sliding through the narrow passage that led to the abandoned tannery. Her destination lay 3 blocks beyond the ghetto walls, where a Swedish diplomat waited to smuggle the evidence to London. If she could reach him, the resistance networks across occupied Europe would know which of their contacts had been compromised. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling as she navigated the familiar tunnels. Her hands, once soft from kneading dough, had grown calloused from gripping rough stones and rusty ladder rungs. The girl who'd worried about rising bread and perfect braided challah seemed like someone from another lifetime. A splash echoed from behind her. Anna froze, pressing herself into an alcove that barely contained her slight frame. The sound came again, deliberate footsteps moving through ankle-deep water. Someone was following her. She eased forward, using every trick Dmitri had taught her about moving silently through the underground maze. The old communist had been captured 2 weeks ago, dragged from his hiding place by soldiers who knew exactly where to look. Another of Tomek's betrayals. The footsteps grew closer. Anna's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the pattern of movement. Someone trying to be quiet, but lacking the practice. It could be a desperate resident fleeing a raid, or worse, a German patrol using the sewers to surprise resistance fighters. She reached the junction where the main tunnel branched toward the Aryan side of the city. Here, she'd have to surface briefly to cross a bombed-out courtyard. The Swedish diplomat's contact had been specific about the timing. She had less than an hour before he left for good. Anna climbed the rusted ladder, each rung testing her grip. The metal grate above her head had been loosened weeks ago by other resistance members. She lifted it carefully, peering into the grey twilight of the devastated courtyard. Nothing moved among the rubble. She pulled herself up, replacing the grate, and sprinted across the open ground. Halfway across, she heard the scrape of metal behind her. Someone else was emerging from the tunnel. She dove behind a collapsed wall as a familiar voice called her name. "Anna, wait!" Tomek stepped into view, his clothes torn and muddy from the sewers. The boy she'd loved looked haggard, desperate. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually neat hair hung in greasy strands. "I know you're here," he said, his voice cracking. "I know what you found." Anna's hand moved to the knife at her belt, the one Jakob had given her with instructions she'd prayed she'd never need to follow. She'd killed before, a German soldier who'd cornered her in the tunnels, but this was different. This was someone who'd held her hand during air raids, who'd promised they'd survive the war together. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Tomek continued, moving closer to her hiding spot. "They had my sister Anna. They were going to kill her if I didn't cooperate. I never meant for so many people to die." She could hear the tears in his voice, genuine anguish that made her chest ache despite everything. But Jakob's words echoed in her memory. "Mercy is a luxury we can't afford. Too many lives depend on stopping him." "I can make it right," Tomek pleaded. "I have information about their next operation. We can save the remaining cells." Anna closed her eyes, remembering Sarah's laugh, Dmitri's gentle hands teaching her to read German documents, all the faces of the dead that Tomek's betrayal had caused. When she opened them again, her resolve had crystallized into something harder than steel. She stood slowly, keeping the knife concealed. "Tomek." Relief flooded his features as he turned toward her voice. "Anna, thank God. I thought I'd lost you forever." The diplomat would be waiting. The evidence in her satchel could save countless lives across the resistance networks. But first, she had to ensure that no one would follow her to complete this final mission. The knife felt cold in her palm as she stepped forward, her decision made. The ancient brick tunnel echoed with the sound of rushing water and distant gunfire. Kasia pressed her back against the slime-covered wall, clutching the final coded message against her chest. Above her, Warsaw burned for the third consecutive night, and somewhere in these sewers lay the truth that could save what remained of the resistance. Her brother Tomek's voice still rang in her ears from their confrontation an hour ago. The revelation that he'd been feeding information to the Nazis, believing it would protect their family, had shattered everything she thought she knew. But now, as she navigated the treacherous underground maze one last time, she understood that betrayal often wore the face of love. The message she carried contained the locations of 3 safe houses and the identity of every remaining cell leader. If it reached the Gestapo, the resistance would die tonight. If it reached Commander Kowalski at the predetermined meeting point, they might have enough warning to evacuate and regroup. Water splashed around her ankles as she moved deeper into the tunnel system. The familiar route that had once felt like a lifeline now seemed like a tomb. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound might herald her death. But this was her choice, not as Nathan's daughter or Tomek's sister, but as Kasia, the baker's apprentice who had learned that sometimes the smallest hands could carry the greatest burdens. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead. Kasia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, German soldiers, their weapons drawn, moving with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going. She slipped into a side passage, pressing herself into an alcove barely wide enough for her thin frame. The soldiers passed within arm's reach, their boots creating small tsunamis in the fetid water. One of them spoke in clipped German about the final sweep and eliminating all witnesses. When their voices faded, Kasia continued forward, but now she moved with desperate urgency. If the Germans were conducting a final sweep, it meant they planned to flood the tunnels or seal them permanently. This wasn't just about delivering a message anymore, this was about survival itself. The junction where she was supposed to meet Commander Kowalski appeared ahead, but something felt wrong. The area was too quiet, too still. Kasia crept closer, using every shadow for cover until she could see the meeting spot clearly. Kowalski was there, along with 2 other resistance fighters, but they stood with their hands raised, and surrounding them were a dozen German soldiers. At the center of the group, directing operations with casual authority, stood SS Oberfuhrer Klein, the man whose face haunted every resistance member's nightmares. Kasia's breath caught in her throat. She was too late. The trap had already been sprung, and walking forward meant certain death. But as she watched, she realized that Kowalski and his men were still alive, which meant the Germans wanted something from them. Information, most likely. Names and locations that could destroy what little remained of the underground network. She looked down at the message in her hands. The coded intelligence it contained was now worthless. Worse than worthless, it was evidence that would condemn everyone mentioned within it. But the paper itself might serve another purpose. Moving with infinite care, Kasia retreated to a position where she could access one of the tunnel's maintenance outlets. These forgotten passages, used decades ago by city workers, connected to the main sewer system but also led to the basement of a bombed-out synagogue on the surface. She knew what she had to do, even though it terrified her more than facing the Gestapo. The synagogue basement contained an old telegraph key, salvaged months ago by resistance members who had planned to use it for long-distance communication. If she could reach it, if she could remember the Morse code Nathan had taught her, she might be able to warn the other cells before Klein's forces reached them. The climb to the surface took 20 minutes that felt like hours. When she finally emerged into the synagogue's ruins, dawn was breaking over Warsaw's devastated skyline. The sight of her city, broken but not beaten, scarred but still standing, filled her with a fierce determination. The telegraph key sat where she remembered, dusty but functional. Her fingers found the familiar rhythm of dots and dashes, spelling out warnings and evacuation codes to anyone who might be listening. She transmitted the message 3 times, praying that somewhere in the static and chaos, friendly ears would hear her call. When she finished, Kasia sat back among the rubble and broken prayers. Through the synagogue's shattered windows, she could see German trucks moving through the streets below, beginning what would likely be the final roundup. But she had done everything possible. The message was sent, the warnings were broadcast, and whatever happened next would unfold without her. She closed her eyes and waited for whatever ending this story demanded, knowing she had written her own last chapter with courage instead of fear.